Does Bijan Robinson have the potential to be the Falcons' greatest running back ever? I've grinded the film and I'll break it down on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And I want to thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is my comprehensive scouting report, evaluation, whatever you want to say about Bijan Robinson. I'll be doing these for all 6 of the Falcons draft picks, and we'll start things off with Bijan Robinson, and I'll give you my thoughts on how he projects to the NFL, how he projects to the Falcons specifically, how the Falcons may use him, and we'll do some player comparisons to project sort of what is at the very least, the minimum he'll do in the NFL and also the maximum he could do in the NFL. But let's talk about the player, Bijan Robinson, running back out of Texas, 5'11", 215, ran a 4.46 40. That's 82nd percentile for the running back position. A 1.52 10-yard split. That's 83rd percentile. 37-inch vertical. That was 80th percentile. 10-foot 4-inch broad jump is 83rd percentile. He hails from the Tucson area, raised by his mother, his grandparents. You can go check out Tori McElhaney's excellent article over at AtlantaFalcons.com to get more background on his love and passion for the game of football that began at an early age. That led to him being a 5-star recruit, the number 1 running back in his recruiting class. He was recruited by Stan Drayton, the then Texas running backs coach, who's currently the Temple head coach, former Chicago Bears running backs coach, serving alongside then Bears quarterback coach, now Falcons offensive coordinator Dave Ragone with the Bears back in 2016. And Drayton is most notable for coaching Zeke Elliott at Ohio State and was a big part of why Zeke thought Zeke himself says Stan Drayton is a credit to, my success both in college and the pros. And Bijan has similar sentiments about Stan Drayton. He saw the field immediately at Texas as a true freshman, splitting time with Roschon Johnson and Keontae Ingram, and eventually took over for the latter and Ingram as the RB1 for Texas about 3 games into that COVID year in 2020. While he only had 6 more carries than Johnson as the lead tailback that year, he managed to have 300 more yards than Johnson did on a similar workload. Then in year 2, Ingram transfers to USC. Bijan takes over as the lead tailback fully. He's still splitting carries with Roschon Johnson, but it's like a 2-to-1 split, 2 carries for every one, 2 carries for Bijan for every one that Johnson gets. Then in 2022, you see an increased workload, continued production. It's a 3-to-1 split between Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson. So Bijan finishes his career at Texas 4th overall, 4th all time in their rushing books behind Ricky Williams, Cedric Benson, Earl Campbell. So certainly going back to something that Jonathan Davis said on this podcast this past week, which was, Bijan deserves to be on the Mount Rushmore of some of the great Texas running backs and certainly being in the top 4. The fact that he averaged 6.3 yards per carry across his entire career, despite playing behind a pretty poor Texas offensive line in all of those years, is just a testament to Bijan's skill set and his ability to create on his own and be able to enhance the blocking that is ahead of him. And of course, you like that because you're hoping that the Falcons offensive line, based off what they did last year, is going to be one of the better run blocking lines in the NFL. And if Bijan could do that behind a bad offensive line, what could he do behind a good offensive line? But when you look at his skills and watching the film, I wound up watching about 80% of all his carries from this past year, 90% of his catches. I did not watch the Oklahoma and Kansas games from this past year, although PFF graded out both games as, his 5th and 2nd highest graded games respectively. And so technically, you could probably say that I didn't even get the best version of Bijan watching about 80% of his film this past season. But, wind up charting a lot of his plays, and the reason why you chart the things watching the film is so that you understand how and why he succeeded and how and why he did not succeed in certain situations. And one of the things I wanted to focus on was his production on third downs and short yardage and goal to go situations, and he was pretty efficient in those areas. Had a 67% success rate on third downs based off my charting, 78% on short yardage plays, and about 50% in goal to go. And most of the instances where he was not successful was due to that poor blocking that we just mentioned. So, overall, my opinion of Bijan, pre deep dive into the film and post deep dive into the film didn't change a whole lot, because I already had a very high opinion of him as a prospect before I did the deep dive. But now my opinion is a little bit more nuanced and saw some of the details. But essentially, the takeaway from watching the film is he checks all the boxes that you want from a skill set standpoint at the running back position. He is a complete running back. And so I don't necessarily have to spend a ton of time breaking down all the different things that he can do, because he can do it all, right? Whether you're looking for power or speed, vision, balance, contact balance, toughness, footwork, elusiveness, ball security, great hands, body control to make contested catches and catches away from his body. He has the blocking skills, not only in pass protection, but even a couple of times Roshan Johnson, his teammate, would line up in the Wildcat, and they would ask Bijan to be the lead blocker on those plays or in other plays like an end around or whatever. And he was a very effective lead blocker in those situations. And so, if you're grading him on a 10-point scale across those various skill sets and metrics, he's going to get an 8, 9, or 10 pretty much across the board in all of those areas. If you're putting a 5 point letter grade system around it, he's going to grade out as an A, an A minus, A plus in a lot of those areas. And his only weaknesses are basically maybe a B plus. And probably the only place that I would probably grade him as a B plus is maybe his long speed, where, he has great acceleration, great short area speed is very good. So over 5 yards, 10 yards, he's going to beat most college defenders, to the corner or in space or whatever. But, when he breaks those 30 plus yard runs, a guy that has an angle on him will catch him down. And so basically, if you're looking at players like Devon Achane, Saquon Barkley, Tevin Coleman, guys that have like that 4.4 or faster speed, and those guys are considered A-level speeds in terms of their long speed, then Bijan is a B plus in that regard. And speaking of Saquon Barkley, it is notable to me that, similar to Saquon, who Bijan has a very similar running style to, that when Saquon was at Penn State, you could find a lot of plays where Saquon was probably trying to bounce plays and looking for big gains rather than just taking the yards that were given to him. And there's a couple of plays like that on Bijan's film. And so when you're talking about weaknesses, that's another thing that you can point out, but it's really a nitpick. And because with Bijan, it was not nearly as consistent on his film as I thought it was on Saquon's film when he came out. We had Matt Waldman on the podcast not too long ago talking about that, and he kind of mentioned offhand why he was not as high on Saquon Barkley in that 2018 draft as other people were for this specific reason. We'll probably have Matt Waldman on later this month to talk about Bijan, and maybe we'll get deeper into this very subject of contrasting Bijan's quote-unquote vision and nuance versus Saquon's vision and nuance. But this is why, for those of you that have heard me sort of offhand in various places like Twitter or on the Locked On Falcons Discord, sort of talk down on Saquon and call him not this generational talent that he was billed to be at the time in that 2018 draft. And this is for that reason, right? That Bijan and Saquon do have a similar running style. Both are very explosive guys. They can cut on a dime. They can change direction at will, really make guys miss in the open field. And that the thing that made Saquon special in that regard was because he was able to do all those things in a 230 plus pound frame, right? And Bijan is a player that at 215 moves like a player that's 20 pounds lighter. And what made Saquon special is he moves similar to Bijan, and he's even 20 pounds heavier than Bijan is. And that was what was intriguing about Saquon, but it wasn't the polish and the nuance and the technical aspects of playing the running back position, the good decision making, the vision, all those things. Saquon was this big athlete, and if you were comparing it to use an analogy from this past year's draft to look at the quarterback situation, Saquon was like the Anthony Richardson, right? In terms of this plus athlete, this generational athlete, but in terms of like being the polished player at the position, with Richardson at the quarterback position, Saquon at the running back position, that really wasn't Saquon's game. And contrasting that with Bijan to me is more like Bryce Young, right? But if Bryce Young was 6'4", 230, so he checks all the boxes. So really, to a more recent quarterback to compare Bijan to me is Trevor Lawrence, right? This player that, as long as you don't have like, Urban Meyer coaching your team, is probably going to be a home run for you in the draft. And, again, this is not the cleanest analogy and whatnot, but this is why I think when people want to dismiss what Bijan can do in the next level, because, oh, well, Saquon Barkley was this generational running back talent, and he didn't necessarily revolutionize and change things. And it's like, yeah, because Saquon Barkley was Anthony Richardson. He wasn't Trevor Lawrence. You know what I'm saying? And so it's a very big difference when you're talking about, like, you're not expecting Anthony Richardson to maybe some people are, but like, you're not expecting him to be basically the standard in which you judge all future quarterbacks by, like so many people are using Saquon as the standard in which you judge all future running back, at least early round selections in that regard. And so similar to Trevor Lawrence, I really do think Bijan Robinson is going to be, this sort of generational, that term gets thrown around too much, but like similar to Trevor Lawrence, where you had to go all the way back to, almost a decade to Andrew Luck to find a comparable talent. I think you have to do the same thing. Like when you're going to Bijan, you're going beyond Saquon Barkley. You're going back to Zeke Elliott in 2016. You're going back to Todd Gurley in 2015. You're going back to Adrian Peterson in 2007. So those are the types of players that I think are much more comparable to what Bijan Robinson did. And I think all of those guys have had much bigger impacts on the game in the NFL than Saquon Barkley did. So that's why part of the reason why I feel very good about what Bijan can be in the NFL. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about what Bijan can be specifically in Atlanta. Now that I've given you a general overview of Bijan's skill set and all the various ways that the Falcons can utilize him, including how he fits in the Falcons outside zone blocking scheme and how much the Falcons are going to utilize him in the passing game early on in his career. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons on our Bijan Robinson comprehensive scouting report. But guys, this is a long episode, and sometimes you might have to give us a pause and take a break to get your energy back up. The enthusiasm for Bijan Robinson waxes and wanes, and you want to have the maximum energy, in order to check out this episode. And of course, the way that you can boost your energy is by checking out the best tasting protein bar out there on the market. That is a Built Bar. The protein bar tastes like a candy bar. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. They have great macros, low in sugar, low in calories, whopping 17 grams of protein. They come in a variety of great flavors, and you can go to built.com and order one of the limited time flavors, and use the promo code LOCKEDON15 to get 15% off your order. But even more conveniently, if you're near Walmart or Sam's Club, you can just run in to Walmart, go to the pharmacy section, grab yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. If you're running into Sam's, you can grab a 13-bar box of brownie batter puff or churro puff. Trust me, you will thank me later. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, want to give a shout out to all my everydayers, but we've reached the point in the podcast for all you everydayers that make us your first listen, where despite my very high opinion of Bijan Robinson as this quote unquote generational talent, I am going to do my best to try to temper your expectations for what he's going to be, at least right away in Atlanta, when we talk about his scheme fit and his usage and all those various things. And so I think when you look at his scheme fit, while I think Bijan is a complete running back, you got to love his projection in Atlanta. But I'm not 100% convinced it's going to manifest immediately in Atlanta, right? And that refers to the difference between running in a gap scheme versus a zone running scheme that the Falcons primarily utilize. And Texas ran a pro-style run scheme that features both zone and gap runs. And that's what you see throughout the NFL, where various teams run both zone and gap. What differs from team to team in the NFL is the degree in which they run one versus the other, right? So Pro Football Focus had Bijan having about a 55-45 split in zone to gap runs, but I would wager the majority of those zone runs were inside zone runs, right? And then you compare that to the Falcons, zone gap split, according to PFF, it was about an 80-20 zone gap split, and the Falcons primarily ran outside zone. And I'm not going to go too deep on the differences between those two schemes, but I do think going to more of a zone heavy scheme is going to be a bit of a learning curve for Bijan Robinson. So it may not be day one, hit the ground running, he's a perfect fit, right? But you'll see plenty of plays on his film where he's running sort of the staples of the outside zone running scheme, which you'll see the stretch play, you'll see the crack toss play. Those are staples of the Falcons run scheme. He's effective on those things, but I do think he's going to need a little bit more refinement. Zone running schemes requires more vision. Essentially, a gap running scheme, the simplest way I can explain it is gap is you as a running back are supposed to hit a specific gap, right? The blockers block specific players. You can think of it as man blocking, right? You block this guy, the running back is supposed to hit this gap if the block is executed well. A zone running scheme is you kind of set it up where there's like 4 gaps that a running back can hit, and it's really about his vision to locate the gap that he should hit based off of different creases and cutback lanes and all that stuff. So it's a little bit more complicated, and I think this was a contributing factor to why Tyler Algier, got off to a relatively slower start last year than people expected. And what was notable is Algier came from a very outside zone heavy scheme at BYU. That BYU had a very similar zone gap split as ours. I was like 75-25. And that's part of the reason why so many people were like, oh, I love Tyler Algier in this Falcons offense. He's going to fit in. But, you may recall if you listen to last year's scouting report on Tyler Algier, I personally thought that, Tyler Algier was probably better as an inside zone and gap runner than he was as a true outside zone guy. And I think that was reflected in his relatively slow start. And I feel like Bijan similarly, may take some time to figure it out, but he'll be fine because he's so talented that he'll be able to get by even if he hasn't necessarily mastered the zone scheme. And, you look at Algier last year through the first 8 weeks of the season, he was averaging 3.9 yards per carry. Then after that point, when it seemed like the light sort of turned on for him, he was averaging 5.6 yards per carry. And so this is not a prediction or anything like that, but like I could see as Bijan's figuring it out, he's averaging like 4.5 yards per carry. And then you're sitting there going like, oh, well, once he figures it out, now what is he going to be able to do? Is that going to be like 6.5 yards or something ridiculous like that once he actually figures out how to fit in the scheme? So I do think there is going to be a learning curve, but there's no reason to think that eventually, he'll be able to overcome that and be very successful in the Falcons scheme. And it just seems like right now, coming out of Texas, he's probably a little bit more comfortable in that gap scheme because it requires less thinking. It's just like, boom, use your athleticism and hit that hole as hard as you can. And it's, you go back to Devontae Freeman versus Tevin Coleman right here in Atlanta, where Tevin Coleman, did not have the understanding of the vision of running in an outside zone scheme like Devontae Freeman did, but because Tevin Coleman's physical abilities allowed him to be similarly productive as Devontae Freeman was in the scheme, despite the fact that he was constantly messing up his reads or whatever the case may be. And I could see Bijan having a similar start to his career here in Atlanta. So it might take a month or two. It might take a couple of months. It might take a year or two for him to figure that out and master that scheme, but he'll be eventually fine. And once he does, you better watch out. But let's talk about his impact in the passing game. And you've heard from myself and probably some others about the potential creativity that Bijan presents to the passing game because of the flexibility and potential he has to line up in multiple areas. And this is mostly a projection at this point in time, because when you look at how he was utilized in college at Texas, he wasn't really utilized in that way. Like they dabbled in moving him around the formation, but they didn't feature him in a major way in that regard. But I do think, again, he has the skill set to project really well to be able to do that at the NFL level, even if he didn't do that at the collegiate level. I think we'll talk about his impact on the passing game, but let's talk about, where it starts when it comes to the passing game which is pass protection, right? If you can't protect the quarterback, you're not going to be on the field in order to utilize your assets as a pass catcher. And, I think Bijan fared very well in pass protection. My charting, credit him in those 10 games that I watched where he gave up a sack, 2 hits, a pressure, and 2 hurries across 25 plays, where he was in pass protection, not necessarily looking at the times where he's chipped, like when he was actually a part of a 5 or 6 man protection, those types of plays. Now, most of the time when he did mess up and give up that pressure, it was because of blown assignment, not because he was physically incapable of making the block. Like, he's very physically capable of squaring up a defender and popping a guy, and is very, aggressive at times when he sees an A gap pressure, and he's going to basically, like, I'm not going to let that guy come to me. I'm going to pop him before he even crosses the line of scrimmage. And that's something that you like to see. So I think he'll be more than capable as a 3-down running back because of his pass protection abilities. And so that will allow him to be able to be fostered as a pass catcher. And he's a very good pass catcher, great hands, does an excellent job catching the ball away from his body, has excellent body control. And it's comparable to Kyle Pitts. Now, I know that's a little crazy to a lot of folks, but when you see like his ability to adjust to back shoulder throws, to make adjustments in the air, secure the ball quickly, turn up field, and all these various things, it is reminiscent of Kyle Pitts. Now, granted, Kyle Pitts, did it at a much larger sample size than Bijan Robinson did, right? And the fact that Kyle Pitts was doing that with his size, his length, his frame is much more impressive than Bijan's more compact frame. But it is one of those things where athletically, you do see that level of athleticism that we marveled at with Kyle Pitts in Bijan Robinson in the passing game, even if it is for a much smaller sample size. But as I said, Texas didn't do a lot of creative or exotic things with him in the passing game in terms of asking him to run a variety of routes, but the traits are there that I could see him, lining up wide, lining up in the slot, being covered by, defensive back, safeties, corners, and whatnot, and being able to run routes that he can create potential separation against, proven starting caliber corners, right? Now, the question of whether he's asked to do that or will get the opportunity to do that here in Atlanta is a major question mark, because, again, he didn't do that at Texas. He wasn't asked to do that at Texas. Most of the routes that he was asked to run were angle routes or Texas routes, as some people refer to them, where he's, running over the middle, out of the backfield, screens, of course, hitches, and vertical routes like fades and goes and wheels. And basically what Texas asked him to do, whether it was running into the flat or running vertical down the field on a wheel route or something like that, it was just like basically run past this defender and we'll throw the ball to you. And like he was effective doing that. And so when we talk about how the Falcons would utilize him in the passing game, again, that's very similar to how the Falcons have utilized Cordero Patterson in the past. And whether Bijan can do more than that is mostly a projection, and we're talking about the potential and the long-term possibility, but I would not expect those things to happen week one, right? Like, I think instead, early in the season, you'll see him be utilized in the same ways that we utilized Cordero Patterson in 2021, which you may recall after that season when everybody was giving Arthur Smith credit for, unlocking the potential of Cordero Patterson, I kind of pushed back against that because I didn't think Arthur Smith was doing that many creative things with Cordero Patterson. He was running a lot of simple routes like hitches, screens, vertical routes like fades and goes and wheels and whatnot. And, CP, would basically on the short stuff catch it and create some magic after the catch, or it would basically, run past this DB or go up and make this contested catch over this DB. And of course, those were all things that Cordero Patterson did, from his days at Tennessee. So it wasn't like Arthur Smith was like reinventing the wheel when it came to go Cordero Patterson. And so I imagine at the very least, because we've seen Arthur Smith utilize a running back in this way, we can definitely expect Bijan Robinson to be used in a similar way. And again, that's very similar to what he did at Texas. Whether they ask him to do more than that, running option routes and all these different things, slants and all this stuff as like a wide receiver remains to be seen. But, it's all part of the development. And so I think you will see the Falcons start with the basics, and then the question is whether or not they evolve and expand from that point on. And so this is, again, me trying to temper expectations that we can certainly be super excited about Bijan's potential as a pass catcher and as a route runner and as this sort of versatile weapon in Atlanta over the next half decade or more. But I would not expect that to be fully formed when the season starts in September, right? You're hoping that that's going to be something that we can grow into over the course of the season. And so one of the talking points you will hear probably a lot on this podcast, not only over the next several months through the summer, but also throughout the season, is the notion of evolving this offense. Very similar to what we talked about last year when it was like, can we go from this run heavy formation, this one-dimensional run heavy offense, to a more balanced, competent passing attack? And then this year, I think the evolution is hopefully we have a more competent, balanced passing attack. And can we evolve that from that being our starting point to a more advanced and innovative passing attack by year's end? Hopefully, if the playoffs are on the horizon, you will see the Falcons playing their best ball down the stretch. And that's something that we can build towards and project forward, but we'll just have to wait and see if it's happened. And so, I think whether we're talking about Bijan, some of the other young players like a Desmond Ridder or the team overall, it's less about how you start and it's more about how you finish. But I wanted to establish that notion because we're going to get into the player comparison portion of today's episode. And my floor comp is going to be very high praise to some. And that floor comp is Alvin Kamara with the New Orleans Saints. And of course, Kamara is very notable for being a very dynamic weapon in the passing game. But a lot of that is due to how Sean Payton utilizes him. in creative ways. And I'm not 100% convinced that Arthur Smith and the Falcons will utilize Bijan in that same way. So in addition to those Kamara comps, I'll also give you my projection for what Bijan's ceiling is in the NFL. And, spoiler, that will also, or not also, but that will be a Hall of Fame caliber running back. And then I'll project his eye level, which is to me the most realistic outcome / middle ground between those 2 points of the floor and ceiling. And we'll get into all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, I want to thank everyone again that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. And for those everydayers, tomorrow's episode, I believe, we'll be having Damian Parson of the Locked On NFL Draft podcast to break down the Falcons draft class. But for those of you that are everydayers that are relatively new to making Locked On Falcons your first listen, and that basically means in the last 10 or so months, you probably haven't heard these scouting report episodes that I do annually on this podcast. And basically how I do it is I do player comparisons, and I compare floor, ceiling, and eye level. And to me, what a floor is what a player is coming into the NFL, right? Day one, week one, first practice. This is what I expect from this player day one. And I think that's important because we spend so much time talking about the potential, as I have spent the previous 20-ish minutes talking about Bijan Robinson's potential, but we never really talk about what the player is day one. And I think because we spend so much time talking about what a guy is going to be potentially 5 years from now, it sets up these unrealistic expectations for a lot of players. And of course, me comparing Bijan Robinson to Alvin Kamara as his floor is not necessarily setting the bar particularly low. But you contrast that with what I think a ceiling is, and that to me is the best case scenario, the max version of what a player can be with the best case development that he can get in the NFL. And the eye level to me is the midpoint between those points, halfway between the floor and the ceiling. And some people see it as a hedge, which, fair, but I think it's a more accurate representation of what a player is going to be, because I think you can somewhat assume that a player will get some development, after he gets into the league for a couple of years and improve from his floor, but it may not reach the ceiling because that requires unknown variables like durability and scheme fit and coaching stability, all these things that you don't really know. So projecting him to be able to reach that ceiling also feels like a little bit of a stretch. So, there's a reason why they call me Mr. Drew, aka Negative Nancy, here on the podcast. So I can't go quite as far with the ceiling, but we'll talk about that. So let's talk about his floor, which is Alvin Kamara for me. And the main reason I'm using this comparison is not only because they're both dual threats in terms of what they can do in the run game and pass game, but Kamara is notable for his contact balance, right? And I know Jahmyr Gibbs, the Alabama running back, got a lot of comps to Alvin Kamara. That didn't quite work for me. Aaron Jones was more my comp for Jahmyr Gibbs, but I think a lot of the reasons why people comp Gibbs to Kamara over, say, like a Bijan is because of Gibbs's value in the passing game, similar to what we've seen Kamara do under Sean Payton over the years. And of course, I'm hoping that we will also see Arthur Smith do similar things with Bijan in the passing game. But mostly this comparison is divorcing us from the pass game stuff with Kamara and looking at the run game stuff. And with Kamara, over his first 5 years in the NFL, he was averaging about 60 yards a game. And you saw him come into the league pretty quickly and kind of be a 1A running back in a committee in New Orleans, splitting time with Mark Ingram and then later Latavius Murray. And Kamara is a guy that is not going to necessarily be the guy that carries a running game, right? He's not going to be a feature back. He's going to be a guy that, his best year in New Orleans as a runner, he averaged 12 carries, 60 yards, and a touchdown every single week. And that's, very good production. That's a guy that's, a borderline 1,000-yard rusher over the course of a full season. But in the year since then, since 2020, we've seen Kamara get an expanded workload, a higher percentage of the carries, and it hasn't led to an increase in production. And basically, Kamara's 6-year body of work tells us that he's kind of more of a guy that's you can realistically expect to get 12 to 15 carries a game, produce 1,000-yard season. That's what Kamara has been throughout his career. And that, to me, is what I expect Bijan Robinson's floor to be. A guy that can get 12 to 15 carries, probably produce 1,000-yard season right off the bat. Obviously, the other thing with Kamara, again, is that passing game stuff. While Kamara was, producing those types of numbers on the ground, he was also catching 80 passes, every single year with the Saints. And I think Bijan has that potential, but again, goes back to whether or not we'll see Arthur Smith utilize him in that way. But similar to Kamara, I think you will consider Bijan to be one of the 10 to 15 best running backs, emphasis on the running stuff. Now, again, Kamara's passing game contributions push him usually into the top 5 running back conversation when we talk about him. But hopefully you guys understand the nuance that I'm kind of divorcing those two issues when we're talking about this player comparison for Bijan. And that moves us to the other end of the spectrum, which is the ceiling for Bijan Robinson. And I stole this comp from The Ringer and Danny Kelly, and it's Edgerrin James, right? And this is going back a ways, but I know for the Gen Z folks listening to the podcast, they're like, who? No, I don't even know who Edgerrin James is. But I think the reason why the comp works for me is because they're similar running styles. They're both these bigger slashing type of runners, but if they want to run you over, they can. If they want to run past you, they can. I know LaDainian Tomlinson is the common comp that you hear from Bijan, and they're very similar from a height, weight, speed standpoint. But to me, LT's running style was a little bit more straight line, where I think Edge is a little bit more comparable to Bijan. And then you also factor in that Edgerrin James produced at LT is kind of the standard for high level running back production over the last 20 years. But like what people often forget is Edgerrin James produced at a level comparable, if not slightly higher than LaDainian Tomlinson, especially early in his career. And Edgerrin James had that same impact as a dual threat runner and receiver. But the reason I think partially why LT is put on that pedestal versus James is because LT's prime sort of coincided with the rise and explosion of fantasy football in the early 2000s, while during that time that was kind of the tail end of Edgerrin James's prime. And you look at Edgerrin James's early career, like he led the NFL in rushing in his first 2 years in the NFL. And he was a big reason why, Peyton Manning, I think, was able to kind of tread water the first couple of years before Peyton Manning became Peyton Manning. And there's analogies there, there's parallels there between what the Falcons are trying to build here, but that will be a separate conversation there. But I do think Edgerrin James's production is that sort of elite skill set, in terms of what he did. And again, you're talking about a comparison that has similar running style to elite production. That to me is what Bijan Robinson's ceiling is. Obviously, Edgerrin James is a Hall of Famer. When he retired, he was a top 10 all-time rusher, and he had a decade's worth of production in the NFL. Whether we'll see Bijan reach those heights remains to be seen. Again, those are unknown variables, but I think the potential is definitely there, and time will tell. And, I think Bijan has the potential to be one of the best running back in Falcons history. I think, he'll potentially be considered one of the best running backs ever, similar to what we consider LaDainian Tomlinson. And to a lesser extent, I don't think Edgerrin James gets that type of recognition by the public, but I'm sure in the state of Indiana, he certainly does. And so, we'll see if Bijan can reach those similar heights, but where does that leave my eye level? And there's not a lot of room. And this was kind of hard to come up with one because, Kamara's arguably, a top 5 to 10 running back today. And James was arguably a top 5 to 10 running back of all time. And there's not like a huge middle ground between those, but I ultimately settled on Frank Gore. Right. And a lot of this was due to a very similar running style. Frank Gore is a little bit more compact than Bijan, but similar size. And the thing that stood out about Frank Gore is the vision, the nuance, the detail of playing the running back position. And hopefully Bijan will get there. But this is one of the things that Matt Waldman constantly waxes poetic about Frank Gore's, vision and all these various things. And this is a big reason I think why Frank Gore is the third all-time leading rusher. Now, a lot of that I think is owed to the fact that, Frank Gore was able to play at a high level for a much longer time than your typical running back, right? Edgerrin James was elite, the best in the league for like 5 to 7 years. Kamara has been one of the best in the league for like 5 to 7 years. And there's not a whole lot of middle ground between those two, but like Frank Gore was like a very good running back for 15 years, right? And so, that's a longevity conversation about Gore and Bijan. I don't know if, again, that's hard to predict, but what we did see from Frank Gore that we didn't see from Alvin Kamara was that Frank Gore, for basically a decade in San Francisco, was able to carry their running game. He was the feature running back. And that's why I consider Gore to be a higher level than Alvin Kamara, certainly as a runner. And so that to me is where Bijan's eye level comp is. He can be a guy like Frank Gore that, again, whether he does it for a decade will depend on unknown factors, but he's going to be a guy that can be a feature running back and considered one of the better running backs in the league, right? But he may not necessarily be considered the best running back in the league. That to me is his eye level in that regard. And so, I hope those comps make sense to you guys in that regard. Like, I think if you looked over the first 5 years of their careers, Alvin Kamara averaged about 58 yards per game. Frank Gore averaged like 101 yards per game. and Edgerrin James averaged about 126 yards per game. So that's kind of, if you want to put a number beside it, it's like 60, 100, and 125 yards is the different levels that we're comparing Bijan to. And I think he'll be one of those running backs that will probably average at least 100 yards or more per game over the next 80 some odd games that he winds up playing. So we'll see how that goes. But I do have this feeling that Bijan is going to be kind of this one of one player, and that 20 years from now, it'll be people comparing running backs to Bijan like we compare running backs to LT. But we'll see how that goes. And, this is as high a praise I've given any Falcons draft pick that we've had when I've started doing these comparisons and player comps in earnest back in 2018. Like, my floor for Kyle Pitts was Logan Thomas, who, while he didn't make the Pro Bowl the previous year, when I did that breakdown, he did put up Pro Bowl numbers. Shout out to Evan Ingram for stealing his spot on the NFC Pro Bowl squad. But like, when you compare all these other first round picks that we've done over the last couple of years, usually I just kind of compare these guys to like a quality starter. Like last year with Drake London, his floor to me was like Mohamed Sanu, which was like I know you guys are like, wait, you called Mohamed Sanu a quality starter, so I have to backtrack a little bit. Mohamed Sanu was a quality number 3 to come into the league, and I thought like Drake London at the very least would be that day one in the NFL. But with Bijan, my floor comp for him is a guy that has made the Pro Bowl 5 out of the last 6 years, and so that's kind of how good he is. And this is why I think kind of the positional value conversation is somewhat silly, right? Like, if you believe that a team should never draft a running back in the first round or at least in the top 10, like, I get it to a certain extent, but like, I also feel like a lot of that stems from people that don't think the running game is particularly valuable. And so therefore investing resources into that is a waste of resources, which I understand. I don't necessarily agree with, but I feel like you have to have at least an exception to the rule. And if you don't, then like, to me, Bijan is the exception to the rule, right? If you're going to have an exception to the rule, it is Bijan, right? And so, I'm sure there'll be skeptics out there that say like, weren't we saying the same thing about Kyle Pitts a couple of years ago? And it's like, yeah, sure. We thought Kyle Pitts was this sort of generational tight end. And there's the possibility that 3 years from now, we'll be talking about Bijan Robinson and being like, yeah, I guess that wasn't the best investment. That's possible. But, I think the notable difference when we took Pitts was it hadn't been proven up to that date that you could build an offense around a tight end. Right? We thought we were on the cutting edge drafting Kyle Pitts, and where this is going to be the next step in evolution in the NFL and all these various things. And that hasn't quite lived up to the imagination over the last 2 seasons. But I don't think you're going to have that same concern with, building an offense around a running back. We've seen that proof of concept be proven over and over again for decades in the NFL, right? That you can build an offense around a running back. We've seen Arthur Smith do that with Derrick Henry in Tennessee. So to me, the only real concern I have about Bijan at the next level is just durability, which is impossible to predict. I'm not one of these superstitious people that basically say, oh, you're not allowed to talk about injuries because then you're going to jinx things. Injuries happen in the NFL. It's part of the game, and so talking about them to me is not a problem for me. And we'll see what happens with Bijan. But, the thing that makes me optimistic that injuries won't be as big an issue for him as say they were with Saquon Barkley is I don't think the Falcons going to be force feeding him 300 plus carries right away in the NFL, right? That's the benefit of having Tyler Algier. And I know there's some people like, well, if they want to justify the pick, they better no, they don't have to live up to your weird standards, arbitrary standards for what they need to do to justify the pick. But I do wonder about Bijan's durability in the NFL, right? Because I've seen plays watching the film where he's got folded in half. There was a very nasty hit that he took in his, I think, freshman year where his like neck seemed to bend in the wrong way where he got flipped and whatnot. And, he comes back the next week, he, misses a couple of series and then comes back and he's fine. And there's a part of me that's like, is he bionic? Like, is he one of these Adrian Peterson level freaks that a few years from now will be like, yeah, he descended from Earth sometime and showed up on this planet. And I'm very curious to see how that plays out. I don't know how it will play out. That's why it's completely unpredictable and random to a certain extent. But at least as far as the prospect is concerned, to me, Bijan Robinson is on the Mount Rushmore of, at least in my lifetime that I've watched the Falcons play over the last 30 years. He's on that Mount Rushmore of prospects, right? And that puts him with Vic and Deion Sanders and Julio Jones, right? Now, whether or not Bijan, the player, is that level, is on the Falcons Mount Rushmore with Julio and Matt Ryan and whoever else you put up there in terms of having the best career in Atlanta remains to be seen. But, I do think it is fitting for that reason that he is rocking the number 7 on his jersey. And so I think the expectations should be high, and it's just a matter of whether or not he lives up to the hype. And, the last point I'll say is, I've been workshopping some nicknames for him. And he probably doesn't need one because his name is Bijan, just like Julio didn't need one. His name is Julio, or Dion didn't need one. His name is Dion, all that stuff. But I'm workshopping Mr. Incredible. So leave a comment in terms of what you think your best nickname that you're going to refer to Bijan as, other than just simply Bijan. Leave a comment here, Locked On Falcons YouTube. Provide your feedback at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, the email address. Hit me up on Twitter, Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or hit me up in the Discord, the link in the description below. So that is where we'll wrap up, guys. Tomorrow's episode, we will be joined by Damian Parson of the Locked On NFL Draft to get his thoughts on Bijan Robinson and this Falcons 2023 draft class. And we have a lot of great guests throughout the week coming on. We'll talk about Matthew Bergeron. We'll talk about Zach Harrison as well. And of course, I think this week the schedule comes out, so we'll get a better idea of what, the Falcons season may look like, and sort of what game we can look at and say, maybe this is going to be Bijan's breakout game. I don't know. We'll have some fun late at the end of the week when we break down the Falcons 2023 schedule. So guys, continue to make us your first listen. Continue to check out Locked On NFL Draft if you want to get more insight from Damian Parson and his co-host Keith Sanchez. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.